My parents didn't call me when I graduated college. They didn't call me when I got my first apartment. They didn't call me when I landed the job that completely changed my life. But 20 years after they packed my belongings into cardboard boxes and shoved them into a basement, my phone suddenly started ringing. And for the first time in years, it was my mother. I remember staring at the screen while it buzzed on my desk. Mom, just seeing the word felt strange. For a second, I wondered if something terrible had happened. Maybe someone had died, maybe Dad was sick, maybe there was some emergency. Then I realized something. If it had been an emergency, she would have left a voicemail. Instead, the phone kept ringing. When it stopped, another call came less than 5 minutes later, then another, then a text. Please call me back. It's important. I sat back in my chair and laughed, not because it was funny. Because after everything that had happened, after all those years of silence and distance, they suddenly needed something. And somehow I already knew exactly how this conversation was going to go. I was 37 years old. I owned my own consulting firm. I lived in a house that overlooked a lake. I had a life I was proud of. A life I had built mostly without my parents. And the reason for that could be traced back to a single afternoon when I was 17 years old. The day I came home and discovered I no longer had a bedroom. The day I realized my parents had already decided my place in the family. And the day I stopped thinking of their house as home. Before I tell you about that day, you need to understand something. My name is Noah, and growing up, I always felt like a guest in my own family. Not abused, not neglected in the traditional sense. Fed, clothed, taken to school, given birthday presents. From the outside, everything looked normal. But there was a difference between how my parents treated me and how they treated my younger sister, Emma. A difference everyone could see except them. Emma was 3 years younger than me. From the moment she was born, the universe seemed to shift around her. Every decision, every family plan, every holiday, every conversation somehow became about Emma. If Emma liked a restaurant, we ate there. If Emma wanted to watch a movie, we watched it. If Emma wanted a bigger birthday party, she got one. If Emma got upset, everybody stopped what they were doing to comfort her. Meanwhile, I learned very early that my problems were my own responsibility. When I got upset, I was told to be mature. When I complained, I was told not to make trouble. When I succeeded, I got a quick congratulations before attention shifted back to Emma. It wasn't dramatic enough for people to notice. Just small things. Thousands of small things. The kind that slowly teach a kid exactly where he stands. I remember winning a regional science competition when I was 14. I'd spent months preparing. I was proud of myself. The awards ceremony happened on a Saturday morning. My parents attended. But afterward, instead of celebrating, we rushed home because Emma had a dance recital rehearsal later that afternoon. The trophy sat in the backseat while everyone talked about Emma's costume. At the time, I told myself it wasn't a big deal. But moments like that add up, year after year, until eventually you stop expecting people to notice your accomplishments at all. The only people who ever seemed to understand were my grandparents. My grandfather was the kind of man who listened more than he spoke. A retired mechanic with rough hands and endless patience. My grandmother had a way of looking at you that made you feel important, like whatever you were saying genuinely mattered. Whenever things got frustrating at home, I'd spend weekends with them. Their house wasn't fancy, it wasn't large, but it felt warm, safe, like I belonged there. Even as a teenager, I noticed the difference. At my grandparents' house, people listened when I talked. At my parents' house, conversations often felt like interruptions until Emma had something to say. As Emma got older, the favoritism became harder to ignore. My parents justified everything. Emma was sensitive. Emma needed extra support. Emma was artistic. Emma was emotional. Emma was unique. There was always a reason. Always an excuse. And because nobody ever told her no, Emma started acting like the world existed to make her happy. The older she got, the more entitled she became. She borrowed things without asking, expected special treatment. Assumed rules didn't apply to her. Whenever I complained, my parents told me to be understanding. She's your sister. Be the bigger person. Stop keeping score. So I stopped arguing, not because I agreed. Because I knew it wouldn't matter. Looking back, I think my parents genuinely believed they were being fair. That's the scary part. They weren't villains. They weren't cruel. They just cared about one child's feelings more than the others. And after enough years, that becomes its own kind of cruelty. The summer I turned 17, I attended a 2-week academic leadership program sponsored by my school. It was the longest I'd ever been away from home. I was excited. For once, I felt like I was building something for myself. When the program ended, my grandfather offered to pick me up. I still remember the drive home, the weather, the music on the radio, the way Grandpa kept asking questions about my classes. I had no idea my life was about to change. No idea that while I was gone, my parents had made a decision that would destroy whatever trust still existed between us. A decision they never bothered discussing with me. A decision they expected me to simply accept. And when I finally walked through the front door that afternoon, carrying my bags and looking forward to sleeping in my own bed again, I discovered that my bedroom no longer belonged to me. When people hear a story like mine, they usually imagine the favoritism was obvious. They picture parents openly admitting they loved one child more than the other. But that's rarely how it happens. Most of the time, favoritism hides behind excuses, reasonable-sounding explanations, tiny decisions that don't seem important by themselves. The problem is that children don't experience those moments individually. They experience all of them together, and eventually the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. For me, that realization happened slowly, like watching a crack spread across a wall. At first, you barely notice it. Then one day you look up and realize it's everywhere. By the time I was 17, Emma had become the center of our family's universe, and everyone was expected to orbit around her. My sister wasn't stupid. She knew exactly how much influence she had. She understood that if she complained long enough, our parents would eventually give in. She understood that tears were more effective than responsibility, and she understood that I was usually expected to sacrifice first. One of the clearest examples happened when I was 15. I had spent almost a year saving money for a gaming computer. I mowed lawns, helped neighbors with yard work, did odd jobs whenever I could find them. Every dollar went into a small savings box hidden in my closet. When I finally bought the computer, it felt incredible. For the first time, I had something that was completely mine. 3 months later, Emma decided she wanted a better laptop. Not because hers was broken. Because one of her friends had a newer model. I still remember sitting at the dinner table while she complained. "It's embarrassing," Dad frowned. "What's embarrassing?" "My laptop." Mom immediately looked concerned. "What's wrong with it?" "It's old." The laptop was barely 2 years old, but that didn't matter. By the end of the week, my parents bought her a brand new one. Meanwhile, I was still using a phone with a cracked screen because replacing it wasn't in the budget. Whenever situations like that happened, my parents always had an explanation. Emma needed the laptop for school. Emma was growing. Emma was different. Emma had different needs. The explanations changed. The result never did. She got what she wanted. I learned not to ask. The older we became, the worse it got. Family vacations were planned around Emma's interests. Restaurants were chosen based on Emma's preferences. Schedules were adjusted for Emma's activities. If I wanted something different, I was told to compromise. If Emma wanted something different, everyone else was expected to adapt. My grandparents noticed. Of course they noticed. Grandpa wasn't the type to start arguments, but every now and then he'd pull me aside. "How you holding up, kid?" Simple questions, simple concern. Yet somehow those conversations meant more than all the speeches my parents gave me about family. Grandma was less subtle. One Christmas, after Emma received what looked like half a toy store while I got a handful of smaller gifts, Grandma quietly shook her head. I remember her watching Emma tear through wrapping paper while everyone cheered. Then she looked at me. Not with pity, with understanding. That somehow felt worse, because it confirmed I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't being dramatic. Someone else saw it too. By the time I entered high school, my grandparents had become my escape. Whenever life at home became frustrating, I'd spend weekends with them. We'd work in Grandpa's garage, watch old movies, talk about school. Nothing exciting, nothing extraordinary. Yet those weekends became some of the happiest memories of my teenage years. Because I felt respected. At home, respect often felt conditional. At my grandparents' house, it felt automatic. Meanwhile, Emma continued becoming more entitled. One year, she convinced our parents to renovate part of the house because she wanted more space. Another year, she talked them into replacing furniture that was perfectly fine because she wanted a different aesthetic. Every request somehow became a necessity. And every necessity somehow became everyone else's responsibility. The strangest part was how normal it all seemed to my parents. If anyone questioned it, they immediately became defensive. Especially Dad. Dad loved presenting himself as fair, balanced, reasonable. But the second someone suggested Emma received special treatment, he acted personally offended. I treat both my children equally. I can't count how many times I heard that sentence. The irony was almost funny. Because if he truly believed it, then he wasn't paying attention. One evening, a few months before everything fell apart, my grandparents joined us for dinner. The conversation drifted toward future plans. College, careers, life after graduation. I mentioned a scholarship program I hoped to apply for. It was something I'd spent months researching. Something I was genuinely excited about. Before I could finish explaining it, Emma interrupted. She wanted to discuss redecorating her room. Within seconds, the conversation shifted entirely. Paint colors, furniture, curtains, shelves. An hour later, everyone was still discussing Emma's bedroom. Nobody remembered what I'd been talking about. Except Grandpa. When dinner ended, he stopped me as I was helping clear dishes. What was that scholarship called again? The fact that he remembered nearly broke my heart. Because it reminded me how rarely anyone else did. Looking back now, that dinner feels important. Not because of the conversation itself. Because it showed exactly how our family worked. Emma's wants became priorities. My goals became background noise. And my parents genuinely couldn't see the difference. A few weeks later, I left for the academic leadership program. For 2 weeks, I lived among students from across the state. People who didn't know my family. People who listened when I spoke. People who treated me like my opinions mattered. It was refreshing. For the first time in years, I wasn't Emma's brother. I was just Noah. I remember thinking that maybe things were finally changing. Maybe adulthood would be different. Maybe I could build a future that wasn't defined by old family dynamics. I had no idea that while I was away, my parents and Emma were making plans of their own. Plans involving my bedroom, my belongings, and my place in the house. A place they apparently believed could be erased without even asking me. And when I finally walked up the front steps after returning home, exhausted but happy to be back, the first thing I noticed was that my bedroom door was painted a different color. At first, I thought I was looking at the wrong door. I stood in the hallway with my duffel bag hanging from my shoulder and stared at it. My bedroom door had always been white. Now it was light purple. Not a huge change. Not something most people would find alarming. But it was enough to make me stop. I frowned. Maybe my parents had repainted part of the house while I was gone. It seemed strange that nobody had mentioned it, but whatever. I shrugged and reached for the handle. Then I opened the door, and everything inside me stopped. For a second, my brain genuinely couldn't process what I was seeing. My bed was gone. My desk was gone. My posters were gone. The shelves I had built with Grandpa were gone. Everything was different. The walls were painted purple. New furniture filled the room. String lights hung from the ceiling. Pictures covered the walls. A vanity sat where my desk used to be. And standing in the middle of the room was Emma. Smiling. Not surprised. Not confused. Smiling. Like she had been waiting for this exact moment. I looked around again, trying to convince myself there was some explanation. Some misunderstanding. Some joke. Because what I was seeing didn't make any sense. What happened? Emma crossed her arms. I got your room. The way she said it made my stomach twist. Not apologetic. Not nervous. Proud. Like she'd won a competition. I laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was so absurd. What are you talking about? She rolled her eyes. Mom and Dad said I needed more space. I stared at her. Then looked around again. Then back at her. Where's my stuff? Oh. She pointed downstairs. The basement. For a moment, I honestly thought she was joking. Then I heard footsteps behind me. Mom appeared in the hallway. Her expression immediately told me everything. She knew exactly what I was looking at. And she knew exactly how angry I was about to become. You're home. I looked at her. What happened to my room? Her smile looked forced. We were going to explain everything. That sentence never means anything good. Ever. I dropped my duffel bag. What happened to my room? Dad appeared behind her. Neither of them looked guilty. They looked annoyed. Like my reaction was already becoming inconvenient. Dad folded his arms. Emma needed more space. The words hit me like a slap. Okay. I pointed around the room. So you gave her my bedroom. It's the larger room. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. You gave her my bedroom while I was gone. Mom sighed. The same sigh she always used whenever she thought I was being difficult. Noah, don't start. Don't start. I had just discovered my room no longer existed. And somehow I was the problem. Where are my things? Dad pointed downstairs. We set up a space for you. A space? Not a room. A space. I walked toward the basement stairs. Nobody stopped me. Nobody even seemed concerned. Like this was all perfectly reasonable. The basement wasn't unfinished. It wasn't dirty. But it wasn't a bedroom. It was a basement. And sitting in one corner were dozens of cardboard boxes. My boxes. My clothes. My books. My trophies. My photos. Everything I owned. Stacked like storage. Like things that needed to be moved out of the way. A small bed sat against the wall. Beside it was a folding table. That was apparently my new room. I stood there staring at it, trying to understand how this had happened. Trying to understand how nobody thought they should ask me first. Trying to understand how my parents could think this was acceptable. Eventually, I heard footsteps behind me. Mom again. Then Dad. Then Emma. The whole committee had arrived. What do you think? Mom asked. I turned slowly. What do I think? She nodded. We worked really hard down here. I couldn't believe she was serious. Worked really hard. They had packed my life into boxes and put a mattress in a basement. Then expected gratitude. I looked at Dad. You didn't ask me. His expression hardened immediately. We don't need permission to make decisions in our own house. That sentence changed something inside me. Not because it was cruel. Because it revealed exactly how they viewed me. Not as a member of the family. Not as a person whose feelings mattered. As a temporary inconvenience. Someone whose space could be taken away without consultation. Someone expected to accept whatever was left over. I looked at Emma. She wasn't even pretending to feel bad. In fact, she looked pleased. Like she had won a prize. Maybe she had. For years, she'd learned that wanting something was usually enough to get it. And apparently this time was no different. What happened to your room? I asked. Emma shrugged. It was too small. I laughed again. The room she'd had for years was suddenly too small. And somehow the solution wasn't adding storage. Or rearranging furniture. Or discussing options. The solution was taking mine. I looked back at my parents. You seriously thought this was okay? Mom crossed her arms. We thought you'd understand. Understand what? That my sister mattered more. That my opinion didn't count. That I should be grateful for a mattress next to storage boxes. The craziest part was that neither of them seemed to realize what they had actually done. To them, this was about square footage. Room sizes. Furniture arrangements. To me, it was about something much bigger. It was proof. Proof that if Emma wanted something badly enough, my place in the family became negotiable. And standing there in that basement, surrounded by cardboard boxes containing my entire life, I finally understood something. This wasn't really about a bedroom. The bedroom was just evidence. Evidence of what had been true for years. I had always come second. The difference was that now nobody was pretending otherwise. Then Dad looked directly at me and said the sentence that would ultimately destroy our relationship forever. Noah, you're 17. Stop acting like a child. It's just a room. And in that moment, I realized I was done trying to convince them to care. For a few seconds after Dad said it, nobody spoke. The basement felt strangely quiet. I could hear the hum of the air conditioner, the faint sound of traffic outside, the creaking of pipes somewhere overhead. And standing there among cardboard boxes containing everything I owned, I realized something important. They weren't going to apologize. Not now, not later, not ever. Because as far as they were concerned, they hadn't done anything wrong. That was the part that hurt the most. If they'd looked guilty, maybe there would have been hope. If they'd admitted they should have talked to me first, maybe things would have been different. But they genuinely believed I was the unreasonable one. Dad shook his head. You're making this into a much bigger issue than it needs to be. I stared at him. A bigger issue? Yes, he gestured around the basement. You have a bed. I almost laughed. A bed, as if that was the point. As if the problem was furniture. Mom stepped forward. Your sister needed more room. There are other ways to solve that. We made a decision, without me. The words stayed trapped in my throat. Because at that point, I already knew saying them wouldn't matter. Dad had that look on his face. The one he got whenever he decided a discussion was over. The look that meant he expected obedience rather than understanding. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't willing to give it to him. Emma leaned against one of the boxes. "Honestly, I don't know why you're freaking out." I turned toward her. She shrugged. "It's not like you on the room." The smile on her face wasn't obvious. Most people probably wouldn't have noticed it. I did. Because I'd spent years watching her get exactly what she wanted. She was enjoying this. Maybe not because she hated me, but because winning had become normal for her. And this was another victory. Another reminder that if our interests ever conflicted, she came first. Always. Mom noticed the tension immediately. "Emma, stop." But she didn't sound angry, more annoyed that Emma was making the situation harder, not annoyed about what she'd done. I looked around the basement one more time. The boxes, the mattress, the folding table, the concrete walls. And suddenly a memory popped into my head. I was 10 years old. I'd spent weeks building a model airplane, hours and hours of work. When I finally finished it, I proudly placed it on a shelf in my room. A few days later, Emma knocked it over while playing. It shattered. I remember being devastated, not because of the airplane itself, because nobody cared. My parents immediately focused on Emma because she was crying. I ended up apologizing for being upset. That had happened over and over throughout my childhood. Different situations, same lesson. Emma's feelings mattered, mine were inconveniences, and now here I was, 17 years old. Standing in a basement, still learning the exact same lesson. Dad sighed heavily. "Noah," I looked at him, "you need to let this go." Something inside me snapped, not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly. Like a rope finally breaking after years of tension. "No." The word surprised everyone, including me. Dad frowned. "What did you say?" I said no. His eyes narrowed. I had never spoken to him like that before. Not because I was scared of him, because I usually avoided conflict. But something was different now. I wasn't angry anymore. I was exhausted. Exhausted from years of being expected to understand everyone except myself. Exhausted from always being the one asked to compromise. Exhausted from pretending things were fair. Mom crossed her arms. "What exactly do you expect us to do?" I looked directly at her. "You could have asked me." Silence. Just a few words, but they contained years of frustration. "You could have called me." Nobody answered. "You could have waited until I got home." Still nothing. "You could have treated me like my opinion mattered." Mom looked away. Dad's expression hardened, because deep down they knew I was right. They just didn't want to admit it. Finally, Dad spoke. "The decision has already been made." There it was, the final answer. Not a discussion, not a compromise, a verdict. And at that moment I realized something. I didn't actually have to accept it. That thought hit me so suddenly I almost laughed. For years I'd acted as if my only choices were argue or surrender. But there was a third option. Leave. The idea felt ridiculous at first. I was 17. Where would I even go? Then I thought about Grandpa, and suddenly it didn't seem ridiculous at all. Without saying another word, I pulled out my phone. Mom frowned. "What are you doing?" I ignored her. I scrolled through my contacts, found Grandpa's number, and pressed call. The phone rang twice. Then his familiar voice answered. "Hey, kid." For some reason, hearing him nearly broke me. I swallowed hard. "Grandpa." Immediately his tone changed. "What's wrong?" I looked around the basement, at my parents, at Emma, at the boxes, at the mattress. Then I answered. "Can you come get me?" Silence, just for a second. Then Grandpa asked one question. "What happened?" I told him, not everything, just enough. There was another long pause, then he said something I'll never forget. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. No lecture, no questions, no hesitation, 20 minutes. Dad immediately realized what was happening. His expression darkened. "You're seriously calling your grandfather?" "Yep." Mom looked shocked. "You can't just leave." I almost laughed. Apparently they could take my room without asking. But leaving required permission. Funny how that worked. Dad stepped closer. "This is ridiculous." "No," I said quietly. "This is the consequence." The words seemed to hit harder than I expected. Because for the first time all day, neither parent had a response. 25 minutes later, Grandpa's truck pulled into the driveway. And when he walked into that basement and saw where they had moved me, the look on his face told me everything. He understood immediately. And unlike my parents, he didn't need an explanation. Grandpa didn't yell, he didn't argue, he didn't demand explanations. And somehow that made the whole situation even worse. Because the moment he walked into the basement and saw my belongings stacked in boxes, his face changed. Not with anger, with disappointment. The kind of disappointment that comes from seeing exactly what you feared was happening. For a few seconds nobody spoke. Grandpa slowly looked around. The mattress, the folding table, the concrete walls, the boxes. Then he looked at my parents. I thought Noah was exaggerating. The silence that followed felt heavy. Dad crossed his arms. "It's temporary." Grandpa raised an eyebrow. "Really?" Emma needed more space. There was that sentence again. The excuse that apparently justified everything. Grandpa glanced upstairs toward what used to be my room, then back at Dad. "And Noah didn't need to know beforehand?" Dad immediately became defensive. "We made a family decision." Grandpa looked at me, then at the boxes, then back at Dad. A family decision usually involves the family. Nobody answered, because there wasn't really anything to say. Mom finally stepped forward. We didn't expect him to react like this. Grandpa nodded slowly. That's part of the problem. The look on Mom's face told me she didn't like hearing that. But for once, someone wasn't pretending everything was fine. Someone was actually acknowledging reality, and reality wasn't flattering. Dad let out a frustrated sigh. Can we stop acting like we've committed a crime? No, Grandpa said calmly. This isn't about a room. I remember the way those words landed, because they were exactly what I'd been thinking. The room wasn't the issue, not really. The room was a symptom, the latest chapter in a story that had been unfolding for years. A story my grandparents had apparently been reading the entire time. Dad shook his head. You're blowing this out of proportion. Grandpa looked directly at him. Am I? For the first time, Dad didn't answer immediately, and that silence said more than any argument could have. Eventually, Grandpa turned toward me. You ready? Just 2 words, you ready? Not are you sure? Not maybe you should calm down. Not let's talk about this. Just you ready? Because he already knew, I nodded. Yeah. Mom's eyes widened. Wait. I looked at her. She seemed genuinely shocked, as if she'd expected this entire confrontation to end with me accepting the basement and moving on. You can't seriously be leaving. I stared at her. Why not? The question seemed to catch her off guard, because neither of us knew how to answer it. Why not? What exactly was keeping me there? The room that wasn't mine anymore. The family that hadn't considered my opinion. The parents who thought I was being unreasonable for wanting basic respect. For the first time, I couldn't think of a good reason to stay. Dad stepped forward. This is your home. The irony almost made me laugh. My home. A few hours earlier, I'd had a bedroom. Now I had storage space. Funny definition of home. I looked at him. It doesn't feel like it. The words hung in the air. And for a brief second, I think my parents finally understood how serious this was. Not because I was angry, because I wasn't. I was calm. And calm people are harder to dismiss. Anger can be blamed on emotions. Calm decisions are different. They force people to confront consequences. Mom's expression softened. Noah. But whatever she was about to say came too late. Because the moment had already passed. The trust that should have existed before this decision had been broken. And nobody seemed interested in repairing it. So I started packing, or rather repacking. Most of my belongings were already boxed up for me. That realization hurt more than I expected. My parents had spent days moving my things, packing my life, sorting through my possessions, all without ever thinking to call me. The amount of planning involved somehow made the betrayal worse. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was deliberate. Every box represented another opportunity for someone to stop and think. Maybe we should ask Noah first. Apparently nobody had. Grandpa helped carry boxes upstairs. Neither of us said much. We didn't need to. The situation spoke for itself. Meanwhile, my parents followed us around the house trying to convince me I was overreacting. Mom insisted we could talk later. Dad kept saying I was making a mistake. Emma mostly stayed out of the way, though every now and then I'd catch her watching, still sitting in my old room, still surrounded by everything she'd wanted. The sight only strengthened my resolve. By the time we loaded the truck, the sun was beginning to set. I stood in the driveway looking at the house. The same house where I'd spent nearly my entire life. The same house where I'd learned to ride a bike, celebrated birthdays, finished homework, dreamed about the future, yet somehow it felt unfamiliar now, like a place I'd already outgrown. Mom stood near the front door. You'll come back when you've calmed down. It wasn't a question. It was an assumption, one based on 17 years of me eventually giving in. I looked at her, and for the first time I realized she genuinely believed that. She thought this was temporary, a teenage tantrum, a dramatic reaction that would fade after a few days. She couldn't imagine that I might actually leave, that I might actually choose a different life. I didn't argue, I didn't make threats. I didn't deliver some dramatic speech. I simply got into Grandpa's truck. As we pulled away, I glanced back one last time. My parents were still standing in the driveway, watching, waiting, probably convinced I'd be back before the week ended. Neither of them understood what had actually happened. They thought I was leaving because of a bedroom. The truth was much more painful. I was leaving because that bedroom had finally proven something I'd suspected for years. I wasn't losing my place in the house. I had already lost it long ago. The basement had simply made it impossible to ignore. 20 minutes later, we pulled into my grandparents' driveway. The small house looked exactly the same as always. The porch light glowed warmly. Grandma opened the front door before we even reached it. And the moment she saw the boxes in the truck, her smile disappeared. She looked at me, then at Grandpa, then back at me. What did they do? I don't know why those words hit me so hard. Maybe because she already knew something was wrong. Maybe because she cared enough to ask. Either way, I felt my throat tighten. For the first time all day, I couldn't find the words. Grandma didn't press. Instead, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around me. And standing there on that porch, surrounded by people who actually wanted me there, I experienced something I hadn't felt in a very long time. I felt like I was home. The first month after I moved in with my grandparents, my parents acted like nothing had really changed. Mom called every few days. Dad occasionally left short voicemails. Neither of them apologized. Neither of them admitted they had done anything wrong. Instead, every conversation followed the same pattern. Are you ready to come home yet? Not how are you doing, not can we talk about what happened. Just a constant assumption that eventually I'd get over it. As though the problem wasn't what they had done. The problem was my reaction to it. At first, I tried explaining. I tried having calm conversations. I tried putting my feelings into words. Every attempt ended the same way. My parents would focus on the bedroom itself. It's just a room. We never stopped loving you. You're making a mountain out of a molehill. They never understood that the room was symbolic. Nobody walks away from their family over square footage. People walk away when years of disappointment finally become impossible to ignore. After a few months, I stopped trying, and strangely enough, life got better. A lot better. Living with my grandparents felt different from living with my parents. Not because there were fewer rules. Actually, Grandpa was stricter in many ways. If I said I was going to do something, I was expected to do it. If I made a commitment, I was expected to keep it. The difference was consistency. The rules applied equally. Nobody received special treatment. Nobody got rewarded for throwing a tantrum. Nobody got extra privileges because they were more demanding. For the first time in my life, fairness wasn't something I had to fight for. It simply existed. And that changed everything. My grades improved. My confidence improved. Even my friendships improved. Without constantly feeling overlooked, I started becoming a different person. A stronger person. Someone who didn't automatically assume they deserved less than everyone else. Grandma noticed it first. One evening during dinner, she smiled at me and said, "You seem happier." The strange thing was that she was right. I was happier. Not because I hated my parents. Not because I wanted revenge. Because I was finally living in an environment where I mattered. And once you've experienced that, it's difficult to accept anything less. A year later, I graduated high school. My grandparents sat in the front row, cheering louder than anyone. Grandpa nearly lost his voice. Grandma cried through half the ceremony. My parents attended too. Of course they did. But by then, things felt awkward, not hostile, just distant. Like we were relatives instead of family. After graduation, Mom tried convincing me to move back home before college. I politely declined. Dad acted offended, as though I was rejecting them for no reason. The irony was almost unbelievable. They still couldn't connect their actions to the consequences. A few months later, I left for college. Thanks to scholarships and savings, I graduated with very little debt. Something my grandparents were incredibly proud of. They attended every major event, every achievement, every milestone, and through it all, they never asked for anything in return. They simply showed up, again and again, the way family is supposed to. Meanwhile, Emma's life was taking a very different path. Growing up, she'd always assumed things would work out. Why wouldn't they? Whenever she encountered problems, somebody else solved them. Whenever she made mistakes, somebody else cleaned them up. Whenever she wanted something, somebody eventually provided it. That strategy works surprisingly well when you're a teenager. It becomes much less effective when you're an adult. Emma struggled in college, switched majors repeatedly, dropped classes, changed plans every few months. Nothing ever seemed to stick. Every setback somehow became somebody else's fault. Professors were unfair. Employers were unreasonable. Friends were jealous. The world simply refused to recognize her greatness, at least according to her, and my parents believed every word, just like always. Whenever Emma faced consequences, Mom and Dad rushed in to rescue her. Money, advice, housing, support, whatever she needed, they gave it without hesitation. At first, I didn't think much about it. After all, she was their daughter. Helping your child isn't a bad thing. The problem was that helping slowly turned into enabling, and enabling slowly turned into dependence. By the time Emma reached her mid-20s, she still expected life to function the same way it had when she was 15. Only now the stakes were much higher. One evening, Grandpa and I were sitting on the porch when he brought it up. We had just finished dinner, the sun was setting, everything felt peaceful. Then he sighed, "Your sister worries me." I looked over. "What happened?" He shook his head. "Nothing specific." That answer told me everything. Because when people say nothing specific, they usually mean too many things to list. Grandpa leaned back in his chair. "Your parents keep protecting her from consequences." I nodded. "Yeah, they think they're helping." Another nod. "They're not." The sad part was that he was right. Every rescue made Emma less capable of rescuing herself. Every shortcut made her weaker. Every excuse prevented growth. And because my parents couldn't bear to see her uncomfortable, they kept repeating the cycle. Year after year. The contrast between our lives became impossible to ignore. I wasn't more talented than Emma. I wasn't smarter. I wasn't luckier. The biggest difference was that I'd been forced to develop independence. I'd learned how to fail, how to adapt, how to solve problems. Emma had learned how to find someone else to solve them. At the time, I didn't realize how important that difference would become, because the real consequences hadn't arrived yet. They were still years away, still quietly building beneath the surface, like cracks spreading through a foundation. Invisible at first, easy to ignore, until one day the entire structure starts collapsing. And when that collapse finally came, it wouldn't just affect Emma, it would drag my parents down with her. The same parents who had spent years sacrificing everything for their golden child. The same parents who believed protecting her was an act of love. And the same parents who would eventually discover that love without accountability can become one of the most destructive gifts a person can receive. The funny thing about consequences is that they don't always arrive immediately. Sometimes they take years. Sometimes they wait until people become comfortable, until they convince themselves they're getting away with something. Then suddenly, all those small decisions begin demanding payment at the same time. That's exactly what happened to my parents. And unfortunately for them, the bill was enormous. By the time I was 30, my life was stable. I had graduated college, built a successful career, purchased my first home, and eventually launched my own consulting company. The business wasn't an overnight success. It took years of work, long nights, failed projects, difficult clients, moments where I genuinely wondered if I'd made a mistake. But every challenge taught me something. Every setback made me stronger. The exact kind of growth that happens when nobody rushes in to save you. Meanwhile, Emma's life followed a very different trajectory. Every few months, a new crisis appeared. A failed relationship, a failed business idea, a failed job opportunity, a new debt, a new emergency, a new reason why none of it was her fault. And every single time, my parents came running. At first, it was small amounts of money, a few $1,000s here, a few thousand there. Then it became larger, much larger. Mom refinanced part of their home to help Emma launch an online boutique. The boutique failed within a year. Dad emptied a retirement account to help her recover from credit card debt. 6 months later, she was in debt again. Then there was a boyfriend who convinced her to invest in some can't-miss business opportunity. That disaster cost nearly $30,000. Again, my parents paid, because by that point they weren't helping Emma anymore. They were protecting the version of Emma they had created in their minds, the version who could never be responsible. The version who was always the victim. The version who somehow deserved endless second chances. Grandpa saw it coming years before everyone else. One afternoon, while helping him repair a fence, he looked at me and shook his head. "They're destroying themselves." I knew exactly who he meant. "My parents," he nodded. "They think they're saving her." I drove another nail into the wood. "Can you blame them?" "Yes," the answer came instantly. Grandpa wasn't usually that direct, which made it hit harder. "You help people learn to stand," he continued. "You don't spend your whole life carrying them." At the time, I thought he was being harsh. A few years later, I realized he was being accurate, because eventually the situation became impossible to hide. Mom and Dad's finances started deteriorating. The vacations stopped. The new cars disappeared. The comfortable lifestyle they'd enjoyed for decades slowly began eroding. Every time they regained some stability, another Emma-related crisis appeared. And every time they sacrificed more, their savings, their investments, their retirement plans, piece by piece, until there wasn't much left. The saddest part was that Emma never seemed grateful. Why would she be? To her, this was normal. My parents had spent her entire life teaching her that other people existed to solve her problems. Now they were shocked when she believed it. Then came the hardest year of my life, the year I lost my grandparents. Grandma passed away first, peacefully, after a brief illness. The funeral was one of the hardest days I'd ever experienced, not because of grief alone. Because I realized I was saying goodbye to one of the few people who had always believed in me, without conditions, without expectations, without comparison, just love. A year later, Grandpa followed her, and somehow that loss hurt even more. For nearly 2 decades, he'd been my anchor, my mentor, the closest thing I had to a best friend. Losing him felt like losing part of myself. A few weeks after the funeral, the family gathered for the reading of their will. I wasn't thinking about inheritance. Honestly, I barely cared. I would have traded every dollar for one more conversation with either of them. But what happened that day changed everything. The attorney began reading. A few personal items were distributed, family heirlooms, jewelry, photographs. Then we reached the estate itself, the house, the savings, the investments. And that's when the room went silent, because the majority of everything had been left to me. Not exclusively, but overwhelmingly. I remember Mom looking stunned. Dad looked confused. Emma looked offended. The attorney continued reading. Then he reached a letter Grandpa had specifically requested be read aloud. The room became completely silent. The attorney unfolded the paper. Then he began. "To my family, this decision was not made out of favoritism. It was made out of observation." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. For many years, Noah was treated as though his needs mattered less than everyone else's. Your grandmother and I watched him work for everything he achieved. We watched him build character through responsibility, sacrifice, and perseverance. I felt my throat tighten. We also watched him leave a house that stopped feeling like home long before he walked out the front door. Mom immediately looked down. Dad stared straight ahead. The attorney continued. The inheritance reflects gratitude. Gratitude for the grandson who never forgot us, who showed up, who called, who helped, who built relationships instead of expecting them. The room felt painfully quiet. Then came the final line, the one that changed everything. Love should never be measured by who receives the most. Unfortunately, some people spend their lives confusing love with rescue. The attorney lowered the letter. Nobody spoke. Nobody could, because Grandpa had just said out loud what everyone secretly knew. The truth. The truth my parents had spent decades avoiding. And judging by the expressions on their faces, hearing it from him hurt far more than hearing it from me ever could. But the inheritance wasn't the real consequence. The real consequence arrived 2 years later, because by then my parents' finances were hanging by a thread. Emma was facing yet another crisis, and for the first time in her life, there was nobody left to rescue her. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting in my office reviewing contracts when my cell phone started vibrating. Mom. Just seeing her name on the screen felt strange. Over the years, our conversations had become rare. Birthdays, major holidays, occasional check-ins, nothing more. I stared at the screen for a few seconds before answering. Hello? For a moment there was only silence. Then I heard something I wasn't expecting, my mother crying. Not dramatic sobbing, not theatrical tears, real crying, the kind that comes from genuine exhaustion, and immediately I knew something had happened. Mom, her voice cracked. We need help. 4 simple words. 4 words I had never expected to hear. Not from her, not from either of my parents, because for my entire life they had positioned themselves as the helpers, the rescuers, the people solving everyone else's problems. Now suddenly they were the ones asking. I leaned back in my chair. What happened? The explanation came slowly, piece by piece, like someone admitting a truth they'd spent years avoiding. The situation was worse than I imagined, much worse. The last of their savings was gone. The retirement funds had been depleted. The house was heavily mortgaged. Debt had accumulated. And somehow, despite everything they had sacrificed, Emma was still struggling. Actually, struggling wasn't the right word. She had disappeared. After years of receiving financial support, emotional support, housing support, and endless second chances, she had moved across the country with another boyfriend and largely stopped answering their calls. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so sad. The daughter they had spent decades prioritizing was nowhere to be found. The son they had taken for granted was the one receiving the phone call. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Mom quietly said something that hit harder than I expected. We don't know what to do. I closed my eyes, because suddenly I wasn't 37 anymore. I was 17, standing in a basement, looking at cardboard boxes, listening to my parents explain why my feelings didn't matter. The memory felt as vivid as ever, and yet, the anger wasn't there, not really. Time had worn most of it away. What remained was sadness, sadness for everyone involved. Including them. A week later I drove to their house, the same driveway, the same front porch, but everything felt smaller somehow. Older, tired, maybe because the people living there looked older too. Dad opened the door. For a second we simply stared at each other. He looked older than I remembered. His hair was almost completely gray. His shoulders seemed lower. The confident certainty he'd carried for most of my life had disappeared. Hi, Noah. Hi, Dad. He stepped aside. I walked in. The house looked mostly unchanged, except for the wear, the age, the little signs that life hadn't gone according to plan. Mom hugged me almost immediately. And for the first time in years, I hugged her back. Not because everything was forgiven, because carrying resentment forever is exhausting. Eventually we sat at the kitchen table. The same kitchen table where countless family discussions had happened. The same table where I had learned to stay quiet while Emma received attention. The same table where nobody noticed when I stopped sharing my thoughts. Life has a strange sense of humor, because now everyone was finally listening. Dad cleared his throat. We owe you an apology. I looked at him. He continued. For a lot of things, I waited. Part of me had imagined this moment for years, wondered what I would say, how I would react. But sitting there, watching my parents struggle for words, I realized something. Winning didn't feel the way I'd expected. There was no satisfaction. No triumph, only regret. Regret that it had taken so long. Mom wiped her eyes. We didn't understand. I nodded slowly. I know. And I genuinely did, because understanding and agreeing aren't the same thing. My parents hadn't intentionally set out to hurt me. They simply spent so many years prioritizing one child that they stopped noticing what it was doing to the other. Dad looked down at his hands. Was it really the room? There it was. The question, the one they should have asked 20 years earlier. I shook my head. No, silence. Then I continued. It was never the room. Both of them looked up. The room was just proof. Neither interrupted for once. They simply listened. You keep thinking I left because you gave Emma my bedroom. I took a slow breath. I left because nobody thought I deserved a conversation. Mom started crying again, quietly. I left because every time there was a choice between Emma and me, I already knew how it would end. Dad closed his eyes. I continued. The bedroom wasn't the beginning. My voice remained calm. It was the confirmation. The room fell silent, because deep down they already knew. They had known for years, they just hadn't wanted to face it. Finally, Dad spoke. We failed you. 3 words, simple, painful, honest. And somehow they mattered more than every excuse that had come before. I nodded. Yeah. No anger, no yelling, just truth. The thing about truth is that it doesn't need volume, it only needs honesty. For the next few hours we talked. Really talked, possibly for the first time in our lives. They admitted mistakes. I shared memories. Some they remembered, some they didn't. The forgotten ones hurt them the most, because those moments had shaped my life while barely registering in theirs. As the evening ended, Dad walked me to the front door. The same door I had walked through 20 years earlier carrying bags from an academic program. The same door I had left through with Grandpa. Dad looked at me. I wish we could do it over. I believed him, I truly did. But life doesn't work that way. You don't get to replay decisions just because you finally understand them. Some consequences stay, not as punishment, as reality. I smiled sadly. So do I, then I stepped outside. As I walked toward my car, I glanced back one last time. My parents stood in the doorway watching me leave, older, wiser, and finally aware of what had happened all those years ago. They thought they lost their son when he moved into his grandparents' house. The truth was harder than that. They lost him one small decision at a time, one excuse at a time, one act of favoritism at a time. The bedroom was simply the day those years of choices became impossible to ignore. And the greatest lesson I learned from all of it wasn't about forgiveness, or success, or even family. It was this. A home isn't the place where your belongings are stored. A home is the place where people make room for you without being asked. And the reason I never moved back wasn't because my grandparents gave me a bedroom. It was because they gave me something far more valuable. They gave me a place where I mattered.